Cioran summarizes the essence of a work that forces the reader to face his own contradictions and the weight of life in this video. We will see how he analyzes the depths of the human soul in his essay The Temptation to Exist in a clear and disenchanted manner, exploring the torment, restlessness, and rebellion that define existence. The content will be divided into chapters to represent the main themes of the work, allowing us to better delve into his thoughts. We owe nearly all of our discoveries to our aggression, which exacerbates our imbalance. Emil Cioran begins the work with these lines to emphasize how human growth, creativity, and discoveries come from turbulence, conflict, and intense emotions that force us to move beyond our comfort zones rather than from situations of balance or serenity. According to him, the violence he describes is both physical and symbolic. It symbolizes internal conflicts, destructive impulses, and struggles against ourselves. It is precisely the intensification of the imbalance that causes us to lose stability and ultimately find ourselves on the verge of collapse that compels us to look for solutions or answers. Cioran's statement highlights a tragic paradox: man pushes himself further in the discomfort, generating new visions, ideas, or actions that change the course of his existence. However, these discoveries often bring with them a form of destruction, both of the previous equilibrium and of those who carry them out. The destruction of the author through his works. No work does not backfire on the author. The poem will annihilate the poet, the system, the philosopher, the event, the man of action. All of man's creative endeavors, whether they be intellectual or practical, are nothing more than tools for his own demise. The human being's endeavor to assert himself through his works ultimately fails because, in this vision, the act of creating or acting in history itself becomes a kind of self-destruction. Man does not drive his own nature to transcend himself. Instead, he returns to it as a madman, creating an unsolvable tension between the need to leave a mark and the inevitable weight that mark carries. An unfinished and tortured creature, this dynamic explains why one's inner balance is compromised when pursuing their career. The philosopher who develops a system of thought that will overwhelm him precisely because the thought once formulated can no longer be controlled by its author, or the poet who invests his entire essence in creating his poem and emerges devastated, are examples that demonstrate this idea. Cioran emphasizes that the only way to escape this dynamic would be to sacrifice all ambitions and talents in order to sink into being, but the modern man, he can't follow this road since he is too attached to his own ego and identity. The rebellion and restlessness of contemporary man, of which we only know the secrets. With this succinct analysis, Cioran starts to sketch the characteristics of modern man. An period in which humans have lost the key to peace and have sentenced themselves to a state of perpetual rebellion is characterized by restlessness. A man with perpetual agitation is said to be violent, not necessarily in the physical sense of the word, but rather in the way he interacts with the outside world and with himself. He rages, suffers, and causes suffering while pursuing an unachievable ideal. However, beneath this violence is a deeper reality that man is passionate about unhappiness. Although cruel, this statement sums up the human paradox that we seek suffering nearly as much as we seek happiness. According to Cioran, people have chosen to make their suffering worse by adding their own moments to it. Modernity has caused personal and historical time to overlap, creating a monster and a narrative that turns against those who created it. Even though religion has declined, the Christian virus has left permanent marks on the Western soul. Even when one renounces religious dogma, there is still a tendency to inflict suffering on oneself in order to find a form of redemption in the intensity of life. Cioran finds an insurmountable contrast between Eastern wisdom, with its doctrine of abandonment and silence, and Western heritage, which has turned suffering into a true vocation. Western man seems incapable of accepting this truth. The suspension of internal tremors and detachment while acknowledging the superiority of theism as a path of wisdom, Cioran himself finds himself in a paradox as he admits to being refractory to it. His instincts push him to reject the contemplative submission required by the teachings, which is not only a personal limitation but also a reflection of Western nature intrinsically linked to action, rebellion, and the search for meaning through pain and unhappiness as a key to understanding reality. Once you have tasted it, you can never get enough of it. This statement captures the essence of Cioran's perspective on human suffering. Suffering becomes a key to understanding the world, a flavor that makes things more real, more enduring, and paradoxically more true. Unhappiness is not just an accident of life, it becomes a constant presence, an obsession that gives intensity and meaning to existence. People become so engrossed in unhappiness that they end up searching for it everywhere, even projecting it where it is not found. This paradox is mirrored in the notion that, although being a kind of enslavement, suffering is what binds man to reality. Without it, everything would seem meaningless and hazy. Cioran also examines the relationship between bonds and sensations. He claims that every sensation is a bond, including pleasure, pain, joy, and sadness. To be truly free, one would have to break these bonds and stop responding to the world through the senses. However, this freedom, which necessitates an absolute purity of spirit, seems unattainable for modern humans. In fact, the sensitive world continues to imprison man, making him a slave to his emotions and his desire for intensity. Therefore, unhappiness is both the source of man's suffering and the reason he exists. Nothing seems more at odds with our habits than the apprenticeship of passivity. Jan challenges us to consider whether we can truly live without the burden of unhappiness or if this is the only authentic form of existence possible. This chapter emphasizes how Western man is incompatible with the philosophies of quiet and abandon, even though quietism in both its Eastern and European forms suggests giving up the outside world in order to find inner peace. The fetish of action and rebellion has actually been the foundation of modernity, making quiet surrender impossible. According to Cioran, the modern period begins with two hysterics. Luther and Don Quixote, though in different ways, both represent the rebellious spirit that opposes reality. Don Quixote, with his heroic madness, represents a humanity that cannot accept the world because it is constantly willing to create conflicts and battle them. Luther, on the other hand, stands for the spiritual rebellion that upends the status quo and ushers in new kinds of religious unrest. Because they exemplify the spirit of revolt and restlessness that becomes central to modernity, these mark the beginning. Luther, on the other hand, is a literary figure created by Miguel de Cervantes at the start of the 17th century, representing a humanity that rejects the real world in order to pursue heroic and impossible ideals. Luther begins the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, upending the authority of religion and ushering in an era of spiritual conflicts and individualism. Cioran unites them because they both signify the transition to a period characterized by rebellion against religious or reality-related conventions. This failure of quietism is not only a cultural problem, but its causes are rooted in the very nature of man. We are rebels by inclination and by principle, claims Cioran. The devil is a symbol of human rebellion, he gathers in himself our impossibilities for Cioran. The devil is not only a mythological figure, but he is also the ideal symbol of human rebellion, of the tension between the desire for meaning and the inability to find it. He is the model par excellence of the revolt against oneself, of the internal conflict that characterizes modern man. Cioran is incapable of embracing a wisdom that requires the suspension of action because humans are idolaters of gesture, and rebellion cannot accept passivity without perceiving it as a sign of cowardice or weakness. As a result, every attempt to adopt a philosophy of inner peace inevitably fails, leaving room for the triumph of action and tension. The devil is a huge sadness who, like us, doubts and torments himself. He is the embodiment of human conflicts and ambiguities. This character becomes central to Cioran's philosophy because he embodies the very essence of the human condition, the impossibility of balancing one's desires with reality. We never emulate him as well as when, at the expense of ourselves, we project time outward and allow it to transform into events. In this projection, man devotes himself to creating the world through action and time, but at the expense of his own interiority. Thus, rebellion turns into a means of alienation and self-loss. This dynamic is aptly reflected in the devil, a character who battles and doubts. He is a representation of our shattered self-loathing. Pride of the tremendous paltry quantity that is the self. The link between the devil and time is another key element. History itself, understood as an accumulation of events and actions, is nothing but an imitation of the devil, a way for man to attack himself and deny his own essence. Only with the end of time, says Cioran, could the dominion of the devil and the tyranny of history be put to an end. Time and the inexhaustible struggle against the absurd. We breathe too quickly to grasp things in. themselves. Here Cioran summarizes the central problem of modern man: the inability to live in the present and to perceive reality in its essence. Time, which should be an instrument at the service of man, instead becomes a prison, a force that dominates and consumes him. Our relationship with time is contradictory. On the one hand we are slaves to it, we live in a constant frenzy, unable to slow down and observe the world with detachment. On the other we try to escape it through action and movement, but in doing so we only intensify its grip on us. I move, I thus emit a world as suspect as the speculation with which I justify it. The philosopher highlights that the human desire to give meaning to one's existence through actions, events, and works is closely linked to this struggle against time. However, in the process, man alienates himself and becomes an accomplice of time, an artisan of fictions that further distances him from reality. The philosopher believes that the solution is to break the bonds with time and sensations in order to free oneself from the slavery of pleasure, pain, joy, and sadness. However, this freedom, which would require an absolute purity of spirit, is still out of reach for modern man. In fact, he is too rooted in his temporal condition to be able to achieve true emancipation.